Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Natasha Explains It All. To continue on this thread of the last couple of episodes talking about democracy and anti democratic efforts, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the United States and some of the anti democratic legacies and practices that continue to today, particularly building off of last episode's discussion around voter suppression. And I want to talk about two American phenomenon. One is called prison gerrymandering, and the other is felony disenfranchisement. So, in the last episode, we talked about how, um, there are very concrete ways in which the right to vote is suppressed in the United States. Many barriers are put in place to make it harder, particularly for certain populations, to vote. And I wanted to dive deeper into that by talking about two specific mechanisms for doing that. The first is called prison gerrymandering. And I'm going to drop a link in the show notes to the Prison Gerrymandering Project by the Prison Policy Initiative that has tons more information about this if you would like to explore more. And what is prison gerrymandering, and what does this have to do with the voter suppression? So, prison gerrymandering is a phenomenon by which people who are incarcerated for census purposes are counted as residents of the prison or jail where they are housed, not where they are from. And you might be thinking, well, I don't understand. And also, that's where they are. Like, what's the big deal? Okay, let's unpack a little bit more. Prison gerrymandering, right? We talked about last time that gerrymandering is this political phenomenon of drawing voting districts in such a way as to favor certain populations, to favor the incumbent, to make elections less competitive, and to suppress the vote of non-white voters. Prison gerrymandering works in that same way. Along both racial and economic lines by doing the following. Prisons in most states are not located in urban areas where non-white populations are concentrated. Prisons, both at the state level as well as the federal level, tend to be in the boonies. They are in very rural areas, far away from lots of things, and honestly tend to be the largest or one of the largest employers in the area because there's not a lot of industry, there's not a lot going on. And so what you do there is you end up taking a lot of people located in urban areas, and then putting them in rural areas and counting them as residents of those rural areas for purposes of the census, which then determine how many districts, how many congressional districts, and where those congressional districts are. And so it takes away political power from the areas that those people are from and gives it to areas where they're not from. And you might be wondering, okay, I'm still not quite getting it. Let's break it down even more. Which we'll get into the other trend, the felony disenfranchisement. I won't go fully into that yet. But a lot of people that are in prison are no longer eligible to vote because they have a felony record, or simply because the logistics of voting from prison is just way too complicated. There are very, very few places that assist in any type of manner in helping people who are incarcerated vote. There are some exceptions, like the state of Vermont, but they're exceptions. So here's what happens. People from one area who tend to be from urban areas, who tend to be from non-white populations, when they're sentenced to prison, get sent to a prison that's not near where they live, that tends to be in a rural area with a small population, generally a more predominantly white population. And those incarcerated persons get counted for census purposes as being residents of that area where the prison is, not where their home address is. And that ends up giving the districts, the areas where the prisons are, more political power because censuses are used to draw congressional districts, to determine how many congressional districts each each state has and where they are. And the additional key layer of why this is a voter suppression tactic is, as I was just mentioning, these people don't get to vote. So they're counted for purposes of saying okay, so this area has X population and therefore, should get its own district, but they don't actually get to vote. So they're counted for purposes of giving political representation to the area in which they're incarcerated, but they don't actually get a say because they're not allowed to vote. And again, on its face, you might be like, well, this just seems like logistically the only way to do it. They are going to be there for some period of time. It is technically where they are. But this is why having historical lens is important, to be able to look at something like this and understand that it isn't a neutral policy. Why is that? I'll get to the felony disenfranchisement portion in just a second. But on this, prison gerrymandering is very reminiscent of a very anti-democratic practice that existed in the United States for a long time called the 3/5 Clause. What is the 3/5 Clause? The 3/5 Clause was a clause in the United States Constitution that said that people who were enslaved counted for census purposes as 3/5 of a human. Yes, that's what the Constitution said. It was a demand of Southern states, Southerners, white Southerners, to join the United States and form a nation because it would give them more representation without actually having to share political power with enslaved peoples, with Black Americans. And so the 3/5 Clause said that enslaved peoples counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of census counting. But those people were not actually allowed to vote. And so what ended up happening, right, is that enslaved peoples were used in yet another way to boost the political representation of white slave owners and all white residents of southern areas that had slavery, without actually giving any political representation to the enslaved peoples. In the exact same way that prison gerrymandering functions in that way of giving additional political representation to the areas where the prisons are held, which tend to be rural areas, which tend to be predominantly white areas, without actually giving any political say to the incarcerated people themselves. And the 3/5 Clause had really, really, it really worked in the sense of giving the South disproportionate representation in Congress. For example, in the first U.S. Congress, which took office in 1790, so in 1790 was the first Congress, Southern states had nearly 45% of the seats in the U.S. in the first U.S. Congress, um, and which didn't correspond with the actual population of people who could vote, right? Of the white, well, and that at that time, right, white male population that could vote, right? So disproportionate representation in Congress based on using disenfranchised people to count towards the political representation of the enfranchised. And so the Three-Fifths Clause was abolished by the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in the United States in 1865. And so the Three-Fifths Clause no longer exists in the Constitution, but prison gerrymandering does. And prison gerrymandering is a legacy of the Three-Fifths Clause, right? It's a continuing practice of using people for the purpose of boosting the political representation of certain populations without actually enfranchising those who are being used to boost the political representation of others. Okay. Now, you may be wondering, okay, I see there's some historical links there. Those things sound similar. I'm still not seeing, why prison gerrymandering just still sounds like logistically sound. Like, it'd be very hard to, track where everyone's from. Well, let's link it to the other phenomenon I wanted to talk about today, which is felony disenfranchisement. So we got to do a little bit of historical backup here as well. In 1865, abolition of slavery. The timing of the end of slavery coincided with the creation of our modern prison system, the creation of police forces and the creation of the prison system. Because the reality is that there were many white Americans who wanted to be able to continue to exploit free Black labor, but now they needed to find another way of doing it lawfully. It couldn't be under the guise of slavery. How else can we do this? Well, that's when the modern prison system was developed, and various laws were implemented to basically criminalize anything and everything that freed Black people did. There were vagrancy laws, loitering laws, laws that criminalize being unemployed, when the reality is that many, formerly enslaved Black people were unemployed because when the 13th Amendment was passed, there were zero reparations that were given to Black Americans. And so many of them continued to basically do the same type of work, now in a sharecropping system, and still not earning any wages, still incredibly poor. And many were, fled the areas where they had been working and had no means of supporting themselves. So anyway, point is that a bunch of criminal laws were introduced and modern police forces were developed, building off of the slave catching forces that existed while slavery still existed. There were like bounty hunters, people that were paid to find enslaved peoples who had run away and bring them back. And our modern police forces grew out of those slave catching, groups. And so now we've come up with a bunch of different ways to incarcerate formerly enslaved, now freed Black people, so that we can continue to exploit their labor. Because now once they're incarcerated, we've got a phenomenon called convict leasing. And convict leasing, like it sounds, is now that you're incarcerated, you are required to labor for free. And that was a literal exception to the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. It included an exception for basically slavery as punishment for a crime. Abolish slavery, but you can still be required to work for free if you're a prisoner. And so, private companies and private citizens would partner with prisons to literally lease out these quote unquote convicts to work on their farms, to work on their factories, to do their road repair, whatever the labor was. And excuse me. And so the modern prison system was built out of this desire to continue to exploit free Black labor. And with this was, a very successful effort. Convict leasing is still something that happens to this day. The 13th Amendment still allows, this slavery exception for those who are incarcerated, again, directly as a result of slavery in the United States. And then to kind of complete the cycle on the disenfranchisement of Black Americans, because now we have a bunch of them that are incarcerated, so they're not going to be able to vote. But then when they get out, we still don't want them to get out. Excuse me, we still don't want them to be able to vote and participate in elections and democracy. So what do? We introduce felony disenfranchisement. Felony disenfranchisement is a phenomenon whereby in many, many states, if you have a felony conviction, you can't vote. In some states, you can restore your right to vote through very convoluted processes, after many, many years. But in general, it just means that if you have a felony conviction, you can never vote again. And just to give you a couple of statistics about this to get a sense of what a big deal felony disenfranchisement is, I want to give a couple of examples. One is from the state of Tennessee. So Tennessee has a felony disenfranchisement law. If you're convicted of a felony, you lose the right to vote. And this law hurt so many people that that there's about 450,000 Tennesseans who can't vote because of a felony conviction, and about 175,000 of those 450,000 disenfranchised citizens are Black Tennesseans. And that accounts, get this, for more than 21% of the Black voting age population of the state of Tennessee. So more than 21% of the Black voting age population of the state of Tennessee cannot vote because of a felony conviction. And there are other non-white populations or other, groups that are also disenfranchised at very, very high levels in Tennessee. To give another statistic, nearly 11% of the Latinx voting age population also cannot vote because of the felony disenfranchisement law. And so imagine how different elections would be in Tennessee if all of those people were allowed to vote, right? More than 20% of the Black voting age population can't vote because of felony disenfranchisement, and more than 11% of the Latinx voting age population can't vote because of felony disenfranchisement. And felony disenfranchisement is, again, tied to this history of wanting to limit non-white voting. And it's incredibly effective, as you can see. And so you have this history of, okay, slavery is abolished, so we've got to come up with ways to make it easy to incarcerate Black people so we can exploit their labor for free. And by the way, that expansion of the carceral system has continued, right? Basically unabated this entire time and getting us into the modern era of mass incarceration and expanding the ways that we can trap people, not only in the carceral system, but slapping them with felony convictions. We have a more recent example with the war on drugs of the 80s and 90s. And one of the laws that was passed during the Clinton administration literally gave differences in penalties for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine at a rate of 100 to 1. So the penalty for the same quantity of drugs for crack cocaine would be 100 times higher than for powder cocaine because of complete misinformation and also just racism, because those most likely to be using or selling crack cocaine are poor people, which will be disproportionately Black for the various reasons we've discussed. And powder cocaine is the type that is more easily accessible to people with means, wealthier people, who are far less likely to be punished in the first place. But even if they are, they're going to get punished at 100 to 1, 100 to 1 phenomenon. So that also dramatically increased the population of both very poor as well as non-white populations going to prison and then being slapped with felony convictions that have now disenfranchised them from the system. I want to give another state example, which is the state of Florida. Florida also has a felony disenfranchisement law, which also had disproportionate impacts on non-white voting populations. And in 2018, voters got together and passed what was called Amendment 4 to change the law so that you wouldn't be permanently deprived of your right to vote in Florida if you had a felony conviction. Basically, Amendment 4 said, okay, well, as long as you complete the terms of your sentence, right, you've finished your sentence and any parole or probation, you should be able to vote again. You should be able to participate in the democratic process. This is good, and lots of studies show that it's very good for reintegration purposes and recidivism purposes. And it passed overwhelmingly. Over 64% of the people who voted voted yes on Amendment 4. And unfortunately, though, DeSantis comes into play again. His administration was like, nah, we don't want these people voting. It impacted a lot of people. I don't remember the exact statistic, but I want to say it was something like, it was definitely over 1 million Floridians were going to become eligible to vote, right? 1 million people can definitely sway a lot of elections. And the DeSantis regime was like, nah, we don't want this. We don't want these people voting. So they, even though through a democratic process, over 64% of the population said, we want Amendment 4. We want there to be a path to voting rights restoration for people with felony convictions in the state of Florida. DeSantis and his regime were like, nah, we don't want that. So let's find a way to make this impossible. And so what they did is they interpreted the law to say that completing all terms of your sentence includes all financial obligations, all court fines, fees, costs, restitution, fees, everything you got to pay off. I'll try to dive into this more in a different episode because it's really a lot. But the short version is that this was a deliberate way to impede implementation of this law and allow people who are now eligible under this law to vote again to not be able to vote. And it's like, it would be one thing if it was very, very clear how much everyone owed and you can set up a payment plan and like there's transparency in how this is done. But that's not the point at all. Like, if you have any workings with the court system, you will understand that financial obligations are really convoluted. Courts do not keep good records. There is a lot of interchangeable use of what, like, the different terms of fine versus a fee versus a cost, what they mean, how much is paid, like how much has been paid. Sometimes these go to collection agencies after a certain time, and then the courts don't follow the collection agencies to follow up on the receipts. And so you have people who became eligible under this law to vote again, who are now going to the court system trying to track down the records, to prove that they have paid off all of their financial obligations, or to figure out, right, what do I still owe? And the answer is not clear, right? And DeSantis understands this. It's the point is to introduce complications and to make it harder for those people to be able to vote. And I will put in the show notes as well. There's a book recommendation. If you want to do a deep dive into the Amendment 4 process in Florida, I recommend a book by Desmond Meade called Let My People Vote: My Battle to Restore the Civil Rights of Returning Citizens. And Desmond Meade himself is a returning citizen, which is a term used to refer to people who were formerly incarcerated. And he was one of the key campaigners, key architects of Amendment 4. And so again, that's Let My People Vote by Desmond Meade. So, felony disenfranchisement is a tool not to promote public safety. It is a tool of voter disenfranchisement for the purpose of disenfranchising disproportionately non-white populations. It absolutely does affect anyone who's caught up on it, and definitely in terms of white populations, disproportionately impacts poor and low income white people. And the idea being that both prison gerrymandering and felony disenfranchisement are interrelated phenomenon in the United States that are designed to suppress the vote, to make it harder for people to vote, and to keep people out of the democratic system. We need to get rid of felony disenfranchisement, and we need to get rid of prison gerrymandering, would be like my policy recommendation at the end. But just being aware as well, right, as we talk about the importance of strengthening American democracy in the face of all of these attacks against democratic institutions, understanding the various ways that we're still falling short, the actual ways that we're still falling short, and how we can do better by them. And felony disenfranchisement is an American phenomenon. Not all countries do that. And there are states in the United States that don't do it at all. Vermont is one of them. And I believe there's one other state, and I apologize, I don't have that off the top of my head, who just never take away the right to vote. And it doesn't make sense to, right? I'm sure people can argue that it's a public safety concern, or it's a fairness issue. But this, the data doesn't bear that out. And also, you cannot separate felony disenfranchisement from the racist history of voting in our prison system in the United States. And so, for that reason, we got to get rid of it as a way of creating a multiracial democracy. So, some food for thought for today as well. Prison gerrymandering as well as felony disenfranchisement, interrelated mechanisms of suppressing the vote. And so it's good for us to be aware, educate ourselves, and then vote for initiatives like Amendment 4 in Florida to help turn the tide on those things. So thanks again for listening. Until next time.